All right, hello everybody. I am here today with a examination of the preface and first chapter of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread, which was apparently written originally in, I think, 1892. The version that I'm looking at is an English translation that was, I believe, published around 1906. It has a preface written by Kropotkin that was written in 1906, so it's kind of in that area. We're going to be talking about this book from the beginning to the end. We're going to poke holes as best as we can in the arguments that Kropotkin is making. I'll have a link to the archive.org version of the book in the description and on my website, as well as my copy of my notes here. We're going to be going through a bunch of arguments here. I'm not going to be going line by line through the book. But I'm going to be kind of trying to summarize his arguments as much as possible, and then bring up kind of the counter-arguments based on modern economic understanding, or even non-modern economic understanding when that is good enough to do the trick. Kropotkin was a Russian noble who kind of abandoned his own nobility to promote the ideas of anarchism, specifically anarchism of a communist variety. The internal contradictions of that we'll get to eventually, but insofar as they're discussed in this particular book. But suffice it to say that whenever he was faced with the actual possibilities of communism in reality, he was like, well, you guys shouldn't do these bad things, but I don't really have any ability to stop you from doing them. It's one of those things where he gets a lot of clout because of his abandonment of his so-called nobility, but in reality, he kind of ended up being converted into this idea of this very strange and nonsensical idea of thought, which is anarcho-communism. Basically, the abolishment of private property, but how? So, with that said, this is not a biography of Kropotkin, but we're going to be looking at this book in particular, going through its arguments, and let us start with the preface. Okay. The first major statement that Kropotkin makes is about the achievability of socialism. Quote, "We see first that hundreds of millions of men have succeeded in maintaining amongst themselves, ellipsis, common ownership of land, etc., etc., etc." The point that Kropotkin's missing here in his little rhetorical flourish at the start of his preface is that those hundreds of millions of men in history have maintained for themselves only the barest subsistence in most cases. Arguably, Kropotkin might not have anticipated the massive gains that were possible from widespread adoption of actual private property. But what we see here is kind of a misguided concern for the needs of man. And that'll inevitably become a term that various socialists will stretch to fit whatever point they're trying to make at any given time. For instance, needs sometimes means meager survival rations, such as when they're talking about what should be given to their political opponents. It sometimes means relative equality with your fellow man when wealth disparities exist. Of course, what somebody else has nothing to do with your needs. And so the word is incorrect there, but it's used in that sense. Sometimes it means something that would improve but not sustain my life, which is, not the same thing as a need. Even such things, and it doesn't just include things like good food, it includes things like that are dependent on a steady supply of leisure time, such as self-actualization and meaningful labor. Communist needs are basically a crutch and a cudgel. They'll use it as a crutch when they're the ones that are, on the skids, and they'll use it as a cudgel whenever they actually have power. That's how we've seen it happen throughout actual history. He then goes on to talk about free cities and guild socialism, and says, quote, "We learn, ... that the medieval cities succeeded in maintaining in their midst for several centuries in succession a certain socialized organization of production and trade." End quote. This is, of course, a completely inverted understanding or, analysis of guild socialism, as it were. Modern economic evaluations of the guild system basically sees them as a slightly less lethal dose of poison than pure socialism. According to Mises, I'll have links in the description and over on the website, the guilds reduced innovation by, compared to a free market, by limiting the accepted ways to produce and by choosing what to produce in certain specified areas. They were often protected by the coercive state in whatever area they happened to operate. Plus, guild socialism and the products of guild socialism typically served the upper classes and not the masses. Guilds basically were given limited but significant monopoly rights by the state, and enforcement of these illegitimate monopolies was either done by the state or by the guilds themselves with the state's approval. I'll have a link here to an article. The problem with guilds, they're monopolistic and wasteful. In short, guilds were better than full socialism, the kind of tribal, communal ownership of all goods that kept people at a bare subsistence through most of history. But they are a far cry from the utility of laissez-faire, where basically people will produce whatever other people want and not what some guildmaster decides. Kropotkin then perceives this reduction of socialism as evidence that communism will somehow result in superior production, something that we know is false, when the theoretical predictions, as we will see, are exactly the reverse. In fact, that central planning reduces productivity and ends up producing things that people don't actually want. That's a problem. Now, Kropotkin goes on to blame international trade as a kind of destabilizing factor in modern times. This is why real socialism isn't working. It's because people are trading across national borders. And he basically says, well, when I say international trade, what I really mean is high-tech nations exploiting low-tech nations and taking their resources at a relatively low price. This is, of course, in direct contradiction of how voluntary trade enriches both parties. You might argue, for instance, that these high-tech nations are expropriating resources from the low-tech nations by force, but this argument is like pretending that military conquest is some kind of free market phenomenon. It is not. It is much closer to centralized ownership and control of the means production by a coercive state or similar apparatus than free market economics. You can't use an example of a group of people stealing goods from another group of people by force as a justification for even more state control. That is to say, appropriation by force of the economy. Kropotkin then makes 3 points about the French Revolution, the one in the 1790s, that we'll look at here. Number one, or 3 things that it kind of was working towards. Number 1, the equalization of fortunes. Number 2, rationally established prices or moderate trade profits. Number 3, the purchase of necessities by municipalities and the sale of those necessities at cost. All 3 of these points seriously diminish the incentives to actually produce. The first one, equalization of fortunes, diminishes incentives for the productive to keep working after they've achieved a relative state of comfort. Number 2, the idea of rationally established prices flies in the face of modern subjective value theory and ends up destroying innovation. If you can't ever expect to get more profit by innovating, then why innovate? Simply maintain the old ways and produce the same, trickle of goods that you've been producing for the same relative profits that you're allowed to get. Number 3, the purchase of necessities by municipalities and the sale of those necessities at cost basically creates shortages of these so-called necessities, which leads to widespread negative results. Basically, substitute goods will come in and serve the purpose of these necessities, but they usually do so at higher cost, right? It would be one thing if municipalities just bought, beans and spinach, but usually what happens is that they say, we need good food. We need a wide variety of balanced foods, and they end up screwing up the entire food market because they purchase things and sell them at cost, which means that, usually what happens is that the people who are actually producing the necessities jack up their prices or are deliberately inefficient or roundabout in order to kind of give themselves a larger at cost to get that little moderate profit off of. Kropotkin then goes into his discussion, into his kind of evaluation of scientific socialism, which is something you hear a lot from socialists around this time. You had people like Marx and Fourier and people like Kropotkin who were talking about how we're scientific socialists. We're not just like doing this off the cuff of our hands. We're being very careful to understand the incentives and the economics and such and so on. This misnomer, scientific socialism, always seems to apply to theories for socialism that ignore or downright oppose basic economic realities, such as subjective value theory, Pareto's superiority of voluntary exchange, incentives in general, etc. We're going to see this over and over again, that scientific socialism tends to ignore anything that gives and call unscientific anything that goes against the conclusions that they're already aiming for. It's worth noting that this book was written in, 1892? The version I'm looking at was written in 1906, and we're in the preface that was written in 1906. So it's even worse, because the marginal revolution in economic understanding of value theory and prices was done by Menger, Walras, and Jevons in the late 1870s. I have an article that I'll cite by Bob Murphy, who is always worth reading, but I really just needed a time frame for when the marginal revolution in economics happened. If the socialists really wanted to be scientific, they wouldn't cling to the fatally flawed labor theory of value long after it was destroyed by actual economic theorists. In reality, what they do is they cling to obsolete economic concepts and tenuous arguments, because only by doing this can they pretend that their ideas make any sense at all. Hell, Marx popularized the concept of polylogism, which all the purpose of that was to avoid having to deal with arguments from actual economists by simply calling them bourgeoisie. The next thing Kropotkin talks about is the notion of free communes, groups of around 2,000 people or so that organize voluntarily and subsequently collapsed, and extols the need for even larger communes and the building of associations to facilitate intercommunal trade. Of course, the smaller the group, the less devastating central planning is, because it's by definition less centralized. This trend of more centralization leading to worse economic results is ignored by Kropotkin here, and it's also worth noting that these small communes never really significantly increase the standard of living of the masses because, by definition, they cannot organize in the numbers needed for mass production. And as Mises said, the real value of improvement is measured by the improvement of the lives of the general public, the masses, and not just some small group of people that get together and kind of pretend to be saving the world. This notion of these tiny little communes, and the fact that if these communes get any bigger, they'll get less efficient, is of course devastating toward any hope for anything approaching a comfortable standard of living for anything but a tiny fraction of the population, which is what we've seen in the majority of history. A small group of people skim off the top of everybody else, keep everybody else down, and manage to eke out reasonably luxurious, at least compared to the average person, lives for themselves. This is what the communal system would end up doing anyway. Mass production, through private ownership, on the other hand, has raised numerous billions of people out of abject poverty, to the point where we can't even really use the same definition of poverty anymore. Modern definitions of poverty are typically relative, saying that, this person here in the United States making only $10,000 a year is in poverty, when, compared to people in sub-Saharan Africa who might make $400 a year, right? These people are wealthy beyond, any reasonable understanding that the people in Africa might have. Kropotkin then laments the conditions of laborers. And this is one of those emotional arguments that communists use all the time, because the solution to poor labor conditions is not to do things that result in a decrease in the stock of capital, but rather to increase it. As Mises and Rothbard, among others, explain, for instance, we can look at Rothbard's essay, 10 Great Economic Myths, Myth 10 specifically. The value of labor is increased by the incorporation of more capital goods into production processes. More roundabout, more efficient methods can be used with more capital goods. and higher production, when it's not expropriated by a coercive state, like communism, leads naturally to a demand for better conditions that would bankrupt lower productivity workers. Imagine, for instance, that the cost of making something safe was $100 a day. Well, you need to be making $100 a day plus enough to make the actual work worth doing in order to make the work safe and do it. This is just a fact of reality. And if people who are only making $101 a day, decided to make this work safe by whatever arbitrary standard the communist chooses, they'd have to reduce their wages to $1 a day, which many people can't survive on, or at least have trouble surviving on. And so this kind of finishes the preface. What we're seeing already, just in the preface, is ignorance of economic theoretical advances in the last 30 years, previous to the writing. We're seeing, weird, nonsensical, rhetorical arguments that kind of just grasp at your heartstrings and say, oh man, we should really feel bad for these poor workers. And also just things that, even without thinking about them from like a deep economic perspective, just create naturally really bad and destructive incentives. We also see misapplication of historical understanding of certain things. We see downward trends mistaken as upward trends, things like that. That's the kind of mindset you have to be in to actually be a communist and try to argue this kind of nonsense. With that said, let's move on to Chapter 1. The title of Chapter 1 is Our Riches. And Kropotkin starts it by lauding this long process of capital accumulation that results in this vastly higher productivity compared to man's distant ancestors. He details advances in agriculture, advanced shelter and climate control, modern machines, all kinds of stuff like that. He states that with the existing capital stock, all mankind could be wealthy and enjoy ample leisure if only those machines were quote, applied to bringing about the well-being of all. This is, of course, the common production for use and not production for profit nonsense. We'll probably get more deeply into that later, but for now, let's just remember that the production and upkeep of these machines is fundamentally based upon the incentives that are produced by voluntary trade and private ownership. To overturn those two bases that created this capital in the hopes of improving the productivity of mankind is a fool's errand. Kropotkin goes on to argue that these capital goods or improvements have been seized by the few. He proceeds with a rhetorical praise of the many who worked and died in creating them. He attributes the production of capital goods to a nebulous labor of legions and argues that therefore no one can have individual ownership of any of these goods, capital goods, that were built upon the bases that came before them. This is pure sophistic nonsense. Of course, capital has existed and been built upon by numerous people over a long period of time. That's the definition of capital structure. But insofar as one person or one group of persons has put forward the resources and capital needed for the production of the next generation of machines, they would not have done so were it not for a property right in the machines that they paid for with their work, with the value that they created. Every individual piece of capital goods can trace its ownership and its production through earlier capital goods. We'll have a little bit more on this a little bit later. Now, Kropotkin is lamenting here, without realizing it, two phenomena. Number one, differences in time preference between individuals, and number two, differences in productivity between individuals. The fact that many people lack the time preference or the desire to be productive to keep themselves above some base acceptable to them level of basically consuming all they produce, does not invalidate the claims to property that productive people and savers have earned for themselves. Then this notion of seized by the few is certainly a thing that does happen sometimes. People appropriate these things, but usually these people are, members of the state and not, or people that are seen generally as bandits, but I repeat myself, and, that's also not a laissez-faire phenomenon. Moving forward, Kropotkin mentions the contribution of geniuses to mankind's understanding of physical phenomena and technological understanding. Now, here we need to kind of get into a little bit of nitty-gritty here, because a proper voluntarist perspective observes that most of our intellectual property system is essentially a guild system, by which a coercive state enforces, by violence, edicts against the copying of ideas. This is definitely a thing that we can criticize a little bit. A modern perspective on however, there's a bit of a like a bias here. A modern perspective on intellectual property is so tainted by the systems that grew up around these systems of laws that voluntary alternatives are largely ignored and or presumed to not exist. If the state had never started trying to enforce intellectual property, alternative structures would have grown up to protect, for instance, an author from going to a prospective publisher and the prospective publisher simply taking the manuscript and publishing it without giving the author anything. There would be agreements that would be signed beforehand in order to, for instance, protect an author from losing the rights to a work, without also getting an agreement from the publisher, right? There would be a much larger, more detailed, legal network around the concept of trade secrets. There would be more agreements to not, you're buying this, you agree not to copy it, kind of thing. There are ways to, do some of the things that might be beneficial, and the strong might there, right? By way of voluntary agreement, but in general, since things have not been done that way for so very, very long, we look at this state system of this basically, intellectual property guild system, and we say, oh, there's no other way to do that. In this much the same way that, who was it? I think it might have been Milton Friedman who joked once that if the government started taking over the production of shoes, within a generation, people were like, there'd be no way to have shoes without the government. And he's kind of right. Criticisms of Milton Friedman aside, which I might even be incorrectly attributing that to him, but setting that aside, let's move forward. Kropotkin declares that because modern capital is based on pre-existing capital, that no man can claim to own any part of it over any other. Again, this is more of that sophistic nonsense. This perspective comes from one of the great mistakes that economists that are not that are trying to either kind of pull a fast one often use. You see it in Keynesianism a lot. This over-aggregation of capital as a big capital K, and it's just a number, right? There's also kind of like this willful blindness to the production chain of any given piece of capital that's going on here with Kropotkin specifically. Let's take these two things one at a time. A factory that produces $1 million worth of goods, or a factory that is valued at $1 million, right, is a piece of capital. If you are aggregating all capital into your big capital K, right, and probably that K is coming out backwards, but if you're aggregating all capital in this capital K, then one thing that you miss by aggregating is how appropriate the capital being produced is for the operation of further production. So imagine a factory, a small factory, a little workshop, valued at $1 million. And it produces goods that people use and love and want and gladly pay for because, hell, this stuff is great, right? In an over-aggregated system, you just count that as, well, plus $1 million to K, right? Capital is, there's $1 million worth of capital. On the other hand, you could have a pile of shovels valued at $1 million. And that also would be $1 million added to capital K. The problem is that, it may be that nobody needs $1 million worth of shovels right now. It might be that it's very, very difficult to find $1 million worth of buyers for shovels right now. It might be that, and to make things even a little bit more simplified, we could also have a $1 million factory where it's valued at $1 million, but it's also producing things that nobody really wants. Aggregating all capital into one big number hides a lot of things that can go wrong, like producing tractors without producing tractor tires, things like that. Now, going on to the second part, Every piece of individual capital goods has some production chain that can actually be looked at. For instance, a newly produced shovel. I love shovels. A newly produced shovel might be owned by a craftsman who, has a tree on his property. He cuts a branch off the tree. He, shaves it and makes that piece of wood good. He buys a piece of iron from someone and, hammers it into the head of a shovel, attaches the two parts, and here you go, you have a shovel. That shovel is owned by the craftsman who created it. He bought the materials, or, he found the materials that were unowned and homesteaded them by using his labor to produce them into a shovel. Perfectly reasonable. In that case, that man would own that shovel. He owned the things that went into making the shovel, and he made the shovel. Another possibility is that the shovel might be produced on some kind of assembly line. It might be produced by a machine that went through some other similar chain of clear ownership, and it might be produced by a worker who agreed to a certain wage per shovel produced on those machines that he does not own, but which allow him to produce shovels better and faster than he could as an individual craftsman. So the craftsman might have spent 10 hours building one shovel, but there is a machine that is owned by a guy, and that guy says to someone else, hey, look, you could make one shovel per 10 hours, and you could sell each of those shovels, and you would gain whatever profit you got, and you would own those shovels. You would gain whatever profit you could get by selling those shovels over the materials that went into them. However, let's make a deal. I have a machine that will help you make shovels, and you can make one shovel an hour, a 10 times increase, a factor of 10 increase in your productivity. And what you have to do, if you're going to use this machine, is you have to pay me part of what you produce. So, there's a lot of ways we could do that, right? The simplest way, the most obvious way is that, well, you know what? You're gonna, it would be break even for you if you only got one shovel per 10 hours, right? So let's say you get 2 shovels per 10 hours, and the guy would say, well, 3 shovels. Or the guy would say 8 shovels, right? Well, 4, 6, 5. They agree at something, or they don't agree, right? If they don't agree, the machine goes unused, and the guy has to look for another guy to hire to rent the machine too. But if they agree, what ends up happening is that there's some value that is going to the guy who owns the machine that helps the other guy make the shovels. This is perfectly normal. This is perfectly reasonable. This is perfectly an improvement for both people. They've made a voluntary agreement. But like that doesn't give that guy who's agreed to work with that machine ownership of the machine. That would be nonsensical. There would be no reason for this guy to offer the use of the machine to anybody else if he couldn't maintain ownership of the machine, while having someone else work with it. The entirety of this unable to purchase the product of your labor thing falls apart completely when you enter into the possibility of renting a tool. That's how vapid it is from an economic perspective. But anyway, so we've seen that there are multiple different arrangements by which someone could own shovels. And of course, there's actually even more to it than this, because, well, actually, we'll get to that in a minute. That's just one of the ideas is that, you make 10 shovels, you give me 5 and you take 5, right? We agree to that. But there's also the possibility that you make 10 shovels, and you know what? I'll take all 10 of those shovels, and I'll pay you the dollar value of 6 of those shovels, or 4 of those shovels, or 5 of those shovels, and you get those dollars right now. You don't have to go sell those shovels. You don't have to go, have a warehouse and find people that are in need of shovels. You just get the money right now, and you can go buy whatever you want with that. Again, because this is a more convenient situation for the laborer, you would expect that things would go even a little bit further in the direction of the capitalist in this sense. Basically, if you ignore the time between production and sales, storage costs, the possibility that shovels the price of shovels drops precipitously between the time of production and the time of sale. You can ignore all these things, and you can just say, oh, but he's not getting the full product of his wages, when he's using a machine that he's effectively renting from someone who owns the machine. And we see that each of these machines does in fact have a chain of ownership that leads somewhere. It leads to somebody. There's always going to, for an individual piece of a capital good, there's always going to be some kind of chain of ownership that, goes with purchases of goods, that go into the production of the capital good, and each individual is going to make voluntary agreements in order to maximize his individual subjective utility. We also can't measure that in a direct way. There is no real confusion about who owns what. Kropotkin here is just trying to use a rhetorical flourish to say everything is capital and therefore nobody can own any capital. It's dumb. It's just plain stupid. But let's keep going. Kropotkin next argues against mines or machines, etc., being owned by the few. He laments that property rights in those capital goods might be enforced with violence, just like ownership of private, personal goods might be enforced with violence. Duh. Should the people who labor renting those capital try to seize it? Well, yeah. If I have a machine and I say, I will let you use this machine and, we'll come to some kind of mutual agreement about, how much of what you produce is mine and how much of what you produce is yours. Or maybe we'll come to an agreement where the product comes to me, but you get, money instead, something more fungible, something more marketable. There's all kinds of agreements that could be done here. If you say, well, because I'm working with this machine, I now own it. That's not how homesteading works. Because, if this machine just grew off of a tree and you go pick the machine off the tree, well then you start working on it yourself, that would homestead it. But if someone already owns something and then they make a voluntary agreement with you to discuss or allocate its use between the both of you, that doesn't necessarily hand over ownership of the device. Of course it could, right? But that would have to be part of the agreement. What Kropotkin here is doing is he's lamenting the fact that most laborers don't want to try to sell the stuff that they're producing and aren't willing to save enough to purchase capital goods or similar capital goods to what they work on, which is that's just time preference and the desire to continue working beyond the point of reaching comfort level, subsistence. This is basically Kropotkin trying to justify, broad scale theft on the idea that workers are just not smart enough. They don't have enough agency to make voluntary agreements with people who own things because they've saved the product of their labor. It's worth noting that, in general, capital goods are not and were not limited to ownership by any particular few during or after the Industrial Revolution. Any laborer could, and many did, by consuming less than his or her income, gradually accrue a savings which could be spent on capital goods or investment in capital goods. You could buy part of a machine. Kropotkin confuses the existence of a bottom quintile of people with permanent occupation of a bottom quintile. We see people like Thomas Sowell talking about this a lot, where, you do a study and you say, well, man, this bottom 20% of everybody, they're doing really bad here, and they're doing really bad 20 years later. And you're like, well, wait, are those the same people? And they're generally not. And they're really not in a laissez-faire system, because a lot of people who find themselves in the bottom quintile through, just being young or inexperienced or just bad luck, work their way back out as in a relatively short period of time. There's a lot of churn down there at the bottom. The other thing that Kropotkin ignores is the gradual improvement of the average conditions of that bottom quintile, right? Like the bottom quintile income as income per capita of the bottom quintile, is gradually improving thanks to laissez-faire, private ownership of capital goods, etc., etc., etc. Kropotkin goes on to argue that the man with nothing must either accept a life of grueling labor at subsistence or die of hunger. Now, there's a couple of mistakes here. Number one, the modern laborer is not working at subsistence. Marx's exploitation theory is wrong because it's based on the labor theory of value. It's nonsensical. But it's even worse than that here. Because what Kropotkin is trying to do here is confuse the reader by suggesting that a man by himself, with no capital, has some kind of better alternative to a life of grueling labor at subsistence. There were, and still are, vast areas of wilderness that a man could wander off into, disappear into, and live off the land with nobody bothering him, probably, right? If anybody bothered him, it'd be the government in general. But such a life would be one of poverty, far below what is achievable through a salary working with existing capital. You know, you can't lament the fact that you have to labor in order to produce when the alternative, if you divorce yourself from the system of capital that you admittedly do not own, right? That you did not produce, you do not own. The alternative is for you to go off into the wilderness and live a life of grueling labor at subsistence. And so, this is another rhetorical flourish to pretend that there's some kind of, better alternative to you need to produce enough to survive. And ignoring the fact that the existence of capital gives you the possibility to produce a lot more than you need to survive. And voluntary exchange means that, you might not always get everything you want, but you're going to get but if you, have the opportunity to make a deal with someone to rent a machine that he owns and increase your production by a factor of 10, or increase your production by a factor of 4, just for your own self, right? Ignoring what everybody else gets. Let's not let envy take things over, right? Like most communists do. But you end up, you're 4 times more productive. You have 4 times as much wealth to spend on making your life comfortable, working in that capital framework, than working, off, on a hidden farm somewhere in the wilderness all by yourself. Kropotkin is saying, well, if you seized those capital goods, you'd be even better off. And it's like, well, yeah, but private property is why those goods are there to begin with. If there were no private property, then the dude who built the machine wouldn't have bothered saving to build the machine. He'd be too busy defending his crap from people that are trying to steal it. Again, the whole structure of capital is built upon the presumption of private ownership. And insofar as that private ownership is destroyed, we see capital structures be destroyed surprisingly rapidly at times, right? I'm reading to say that I'm reading is maybe overselling it. I was in the middle of reading The Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest, and the simple acts that the Soviet government did to the people of Ukraine in taking away their ability to own farms and, keep more than one goat, basically destroyed the ability of that whole group of people to produce in less than a generation's time. We're talking like 5 years, less than 10 years. And they went from being the breadbasket of Europe to being to literally starving to death in the millions, right? The capital structure is very easy to break down very rapidly when the incentives that led to its production go away. Suddenly everybody's like, well, I better consume this because otherwise I'm not going to get anything out of it. This is another problem that a lot of communists have. They assume that they can get people to work against their own personal incentives as opposed to letting themselves become wealthy by owning things. The crime of ownership is worse than the inconvenience of dying of starvation. It's a very weird and very self-destructive position, but it is what the communists have, so we got to talk about it. So, continuing with our critique here of Kropotkin's notion about a man must accept a life of grueling labor at subsistence. Insofar as he wants to pretend that leisure without some kind of action to pay for it is possible, this is only possible through 2 methods. Number 1, charity. That is to say, voluntary donations of goods to others, taken from a surplus which must also be produced. by others as well, or by theft, that is to say, force, fraud, taxation, etc. There's no other way to magically make ham fall from the sky, right? It'd be great if there was a way to make everything that we needed fall from the sky like manna from heaven, but there's not. It has to be produced. And if you want to consume more than you produce, then you must either rely upon charity, which is people saying, well, I pity you, and therefore we will give you these things that you produce, or you must take it from people against their will. And again, he's ignoring, or this argument ignores the clear Pareto superiority of voluntary exchange over involuntary exchange. Again, capital structures can collapse way faster than you might think. It's also worth remembering that in the case of a worker in a relatively rich country laboring for wages, there's a lower state of subsistence that's possible, right? The person, again, who's making $10,000 in America, is impoverished. But it's certainly possible to live on $2 a day. People do it. The problem is that they feel bad about living on $2 a day when everybody else is saying, well, I make $10,000 a year, I'll spend most of that. So they by way of envy, they say, well, I won't save anything because I'm so poor. And they remain poor. In fact, many people do this. They're like, well, I live paycheck to paycheck. It's like, well, you don't need to live paycheck to paycheck. You could make changes in your lifestyle to reduce your cost of living. It would suck in the short term, but what it would do is it would allow you to save up to deal with, just emergencies, or to actually build up some kind of a nest egg that you could then invest into something that would provide returns. Many laborers who are down at the poverty level, in fact, do this. They scrupulously save. They put money into their children's college funds. They put money into savings accounts or bonds or whatever. And insofar as they do this, they work towards pushing themselves from abject poverty to a higher state, to one where they are more comfortable, to one where their income is greater than what they're simply producing from day to day. And that is something that a lot of people can do. And what Kropotkin is doing here is he's basically saying subsistence in post-industrial revolution England is just as bad as subsistence in in rural sub-Saharan Africa in the 1700s. They're not the same thing. And therefore, it is actually possible for the laborer to save, assuming that the state doesn't forbid it in some particular way. Again, I need to underline as well, over and over and over again, they always make this mistake, but modern subjective value theory invalidates the Marxist exploitation theory. The neo-Marxists do try to tack on new things to try to make exploitation theory continue to work. But the fact of the matter is that Marx's formulation of exploitation theory is dependent upon the labor theory of value. And the fact that the labor theory of value collapsed basically means that all of Marx's arguments about exploitation need to be rebuilt from the ground up. And it's a lot harder than avowed communists will pretend that it is. There's a quote that Kropotkin says here. Quote, "The working people cannot purchase with their wages the wealth which they have produced. Yes, because they are renting tools from other people. Because the calculation that a person who is working with tools provided by someone else should be able to purchase the wealth that they have produced makes so many economic mistakes that we've already covered in a little bit of detail that it's not even funny. The calculation ignores the existing value of upkeep on the capital, which they effectively rented from someone else who had to save and is expecting return on that savings. It ignores the time discount due to them receiving their wages when the goods are produced as opposed to when the goods are sold. Both of these arrangements make the condition of the wage laborer better, not worse. The alternative would be that they have to produce with their bare hands until they can purchase capital goods for themselves. It'd be way better if they could just rent it from someone who already made the savings. That's what capital ownership does. That's what wage earning does. And then it would be worse if they were only paid when the goods were sold to retailers, or possibly even later, maybe when the retailers sell them. And, it would suck if their wages were dependent upon the ultimate profitability of the production they were involved in. Mistakes are made by entrepreneurs all the time. An entrepreneur will put together a thing, some long series of stuff that will consume a bunch of capital goods to produce an output that it turns out actually don't, create much of a profit on the market. And those workers still get paid. They might have to go find new jobs after all the capital is expended because, this wasn't profitable. But they still get paid for the time that they're working. And then they get to move on, and they can even claim, I worked here, and they closed the factory down, so they had to fire, everybody because the company went under. But, I did work here, and, you can call this guy, and he'll tell you that I worked hard, kind of thing. Of course, Kropotkin ignores this because it's really convenient for him to ignore this. What's happening, and the reason why the working people cannot purchase with their wages the wealth which they have produced, is because the holders of capital are taking on a bunch of the risks of production, and the value of this risk-taking is not negligible. It's non-zero. It's a significant fraction of the actual production. And that's why workers don't get paid enough to buy everything that they produce, because they're renting machines and they're absolving themselves of risk that the capitalists have to maintain, or at least deal with. At the end of this chapter, Kropotkin concludes with a passionate but highly illogical plea for collective ownership, on the basis that property is, quote, the collective work of humanity. Oh, that sounds so beautiful, doesn't it? This is, of course, a rhetorical trick. It's based on the aggregation of all capital into one giant pile and pretending that we can't trace the ownership of a particular pair of pliers to someone who bought it, and then from there to someone who, bought it from a producer, Ace Hardware, bought it from a company that produces pliers, and the pliers company had to produce the pliers on machines that were built out of metal, and they had to, buy metal to produce the pliers from, plastic for the handles, yada, yada, yada. If we ignore all of that and we aggregate everything into some big pile of capital that mankind owns, then yeah, this argument makes sense, but unfortunately, neither of those things is a realistic interpretation of reality. Again, this kind of over-aggregation is a serious problem which leads to impoverishment, not just like oopsie-doopsie, like actual people starving to death. Misapplications of capital, destruction of the capital structure is caused by pretending that you can't tell who owns a shovel. Any analysis of central planning will show you how messed up this idea is. I'll cite two here. There's one by Mises. It's a book called Planned Chaos. It's not a very long book. And then there's also a article or an essay by Friedrich Hayek called "The Use of Knowledge in Society," and I'll put links to those in the description. YouTube isn't anyway. I'll put links to those in the description. But yeah. That is the preface in Chapter 1 of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. We are seeing some pretty sad arguments here. We're seeing a lot of just bad economics. We're seeing a lot of rhetorical tricks to make something sound good that actually results in the starvation of mankind. We're seeing ignorance. We're seeing ignorance of modern economics because, again, Kropotkin wrote this 20 years approximately after the marginal revolution of value theory. He wrote the preface to this particular edition 30 years after the development of marginal value theory, and he ignores this in favor of a nonsensical value system that basically produces incorrect economic conclusions, as you might expect. The basis is wrong, therefore the corollaries are wrong. We have Kropotkin making incorrect evaluations of the progress of socialism in particular circumstances. He sees pure tribal socialism being converted to guild socialism and says, oh, look, this guild thing is like socialism. It's doing better, though. And he's saying, but he's ignoring the fact that this is less socialistic than the kind of tribal communalism that came earlier in history. And of course, he's ignoring the possibility that there isn't some guy that tells you, you're going to make these particular watches for the rest of your life. Don't change the procedure at all, and only sell them to people that can really afford, that can really pay a lot of money for them. No. He makes the exact opposite conclusion and says, oh, this guild socialism kind of sort of worked, and there was more innovation than the previous parts of history. Which, I mean, of course, he came before a lot of the modern, free market or free-ish market stuff that has happened in the last 120-some years or so. There's when a market is free, and we can break this down into markets, like smaller markets, right? Like when the computer market came onto the scene, and it wasn't really, regulated in any strong way, it was going like crazy, and now it's kind of petered down to, kind of a regular captured market by the state, where, it does a lot less than it used to as far as advancements, price reductions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We see a lot of rhetorical tricks. We see a lot of lamenting the conditions of laborers without looking at the responsibility of why these guys have no savings to begin with, is not pretending that it's not at least partially their fault. We see a lot of confusion of private property being conflated with a person stealing from another person by way of force of arms. And of course, from a voluntarist perspective, we can see the difference between these two things. Kropotkin can't, and that's his fault. That's a fault in his reasoning, and not something that we should aspire to. So, that, I think, covers it for today. I'm going to continue going through chapters of Kropotkin, Conquest of Bread, maybe once a week, maybe a little bit faster than that. We'll see. It's interesting because Kropotkin is supposedly an anarcho-communist. And so we're going to have an opportunity to look at his particular arguments about anarcho-communism, and we're going to have to poke some holes in those, or at least we're going to try. Maybe we'll find that there's something in this later on that, really, really works perfectly well. But so far, we've seen a lot of really disingenuous, rhetorical tricks, a lot of really bad economics, and a lot of ignorance of certain circumstances and, differences between this and that taken to be similarities. It's really weird so far. So we'll see how this goes. Anyway, I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Again, links to articles and books and stuff in the description and over on the website, marginalnonhermit.com. You can put in the www if you want, but it's not necessary. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I think I already said that. But anyway, have a good week, and I will see you all next time.